Hello, and welcome to today's event, Advancing Gender Representation and Equality in the European Union, co-hosted by the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program and Women in International Security Global. My name is Ariella Blatter, and I am the President and CEO of WIIS Global. Over the last 35 years, WIIS has grown to become the premier global network promoting women's advancement and gender equality in the peace and security sector. We have members in roughly 50 countries, focused on research projects and policy engagement initiatives on critical international security issues, bridging the gap between gender and security. I would like to thank the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program, Duncan Wood and Teresa Ader for their partnership today. I would also like to thank Chantal de Jong Udrat, current fellow at the Wilson Center and member of the board of directors at WIIS Global. And as many of you know, Chantal served as the president of WIIS Global from 2013 to 2021, where she contributed her expertise on women, peace and security, gender, and launching WIIS's UN Security Council 1325 assessment frameworks, and grew our global affiliates exponentially, among many other notable accomplishments. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists today, Karen Johnston, Senior Fellow at WIIS Global and author of our policy brief, Advancing Gender Equality in the European Union, Michelle Egan of the Wilson Center, Professor and G. Monet Chair, School of International Service at American University, and Roberta Garina, Professor, School of Sociology at the University of Bristol. As mentioned, Karen's excellent policy brief examines efforts by the EU to achieve gender equality in its institutions and in the EU's common security and defense policy. The brief also addresses how gains in the Gender Equality Strategy 2022 to 2025 and Gender Action Plan have been distributed unevenly across EU institutions, and asks the question, what can be done to create greater momentum towards achieving greater gains in gender equality? I look forward to hearing from our speakers about advancing gender representation and making gender equality a reality in the European Union. Without further ado, let me turn to Chantal.
Thank you very much, Ariella. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Karen with her policy brief on gender equality in the EU. Karen, as you have pointed out, the EU is seen and respected by many observers for its leadership and commitment to human rights and democracy. Gender equality is part of the foundational documents of the Union. And as you mentioned in the brief, the Union tabled in 2020 a very ambitious gender equality strategy to be implemented within the EU. And I would say, generally, the EU is seen as a driver of progress on gender equality. Where the EU falls short is in implementation. And I think this is particularly true in the political realm and in the defense and the security sector, and particularly in terms of representation. And you show that very clearly by presenting the data. We are far from parity. I think more generally, we can measure commitment to gender equality by looking at policy commitments, by looking at representation, and by looking at the resources that are allocated to the issue. Now, in terms of policy commitment, and if we stick to the foreign affairs and defense side, we have two main documents: the 2020 Gender Equality Strategy, but we also have the 2018 and 2019 Women, Peace and Security Strategy and Action Plans. And I would say all three of these documents are really very ambitious documents. That said, I will be curious to see how gender will be integrated in the new EU Strategic Compass. That is that new document that is currently under development and which should define and develop a strategic vision for the EU. It is analyzing key threats and challenges to Europe. I'm not quite that optimistic for the strategic compass. You mentioned in the policy brief the opposition of Hungary and Poland to all gender equality language. And I would also recall that in the 2016 EU Global Strategy for Foreign and Security Policy, while that strategy embraced a broad vision of security, embraced human security, the idea of the Women, Peace and Security agenda wasn't really mentioned. It was mentioned only in passing. I mean, the strategic compass is not public yet, but what I've heard is that currently gender equality is still part of that document. But some people have also said that it might not survive the process. So we will see early next year whether and how and to what extent gender is integrated in that document. When we look at resources being allocated to the issue of gender equality, I mean, show me the money is always, you know, the clearest way to show whether there is real political commitment. And again, and I think you point this out in the policy brief, the EU is not doing very well. A 2020 report that you cite by the European Court of Auditors shows that the Union lacks specific budget tools to ensure that its spending advances gender equality. And, you know, this is particularly shocking in the case of home affairs and development and cooperation. And it stands in such stark contrast to the legal and political commitments the EU has made to gender equality. Now, I think in terms of your recommendations, I think they're all well taken. And you make a very important point, namely that advancing gender equality has to start at home. The EU can lead by example. The fact that the EU now has 4 governments, Sweden, France, Spain, and now Germany, that have embraced a feminist foreign policy might be hopeful. And I hear that in the Netherlands, there's also some interest in possibly looking into the fact of embracing a feminist foreign policy. To conclude, I think, you know, and you show this in your brief as well, gender dynamics are really crucial in understanding security challenges, crucial in understanding not only the effects and impact, but also, I think, causal pathways. And it is vitally important that civil society organizations keep pushing these issues, keep governments accountable to their policy declarations. And I hope that you will take up this issue, Karen, next year when the strategic compass is being published. So again, congratulations, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Chantal, and thank you for bringing up the very important implementation gap and resource gap, which I hope that we can weave through our conversations. I'd like to give Karen an opportunity to respond to some of the excellent points made here before we move to this block of questions on gender, the EU and its external relations. Can you talk a little bit about your reflections on needing to the EU lens at home, so to speak, and also some of the advancing doctrine through the strategic compass, as well as just any other comments that you have from her commentary?
Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be with such a wonderful group of people. I think some of my comments more specifically are about kind of the institutional restraints and some of the institutional challenges that you see. But what I'm so thankful for is having the opportunity with Michelle and Roberta to look and to argue that the institutional constraints and the institutional challenges and the reforms that are recommended, it's the first step, right? It's not the only step that we need. In fact, we have to look much more beyond just institutional reforms and look at sort of implicit norms and processes and how we deal with the kinds of hurdles that we have for example, in dealing with setbacks to the advancement of gender equality through the kind of setbacks that we see with Hungary and Poland, with sort of the normative aspects of it. So I think that we'll have a real opportunity to look at both sort of the institutional things and the much more sort of critical, I think, questions about how we deal with these sort of sort of material and other aspects of it. So, and I just wanted to start with saying I was really interested to know more about the state of the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen's efforts to advance gender equality in the EU. And more generally, I think there were certain points that sort of came out and that were relevant. First, again, as we all know, while the EU has made significant strides, its achievements have been unevenly distributed and implemented. And I think this is important for the discussion to follow. It's uneven in its geographic distribution. That is, of course, Nordic states are doing better at implementing these policies than, say, Cyprus and Bulgaria. And it's uneven in the issue domains, especially in foreign and security policy. I mean, not only does the European Parliament and some of the internal documents show this, the World Economic Forum data and other security data tell us that it is in the domain of political empowerment and access to political positions of political power where women are most disadvantaged across EU institutions and offices and agencies. And not surprisingly, when women do advance to top management and top level positions, they're often not given the sort of hard issue areas of finance and economics, foreign and defense policy, but more the soft issue sociocultural policies. And again, there are a host of structural and institutional barriers that have to be dismantled, but also, again, one of the disturbing things is the right-wing populist parties weakened democratic institutions and governments across the United States. And we see then through this that gender and women's rights have come under attack in countries such as Poland and Hungary. And I think this last point is relevant to the question of the GAP 3 and sort of the external relations of the EU. So we saw, as Chantal noted, a number of very ambitious gender equality documents in 2020. The first European Commission gender equality strategy that tackled things like gender-based violence, economic inequalities, leadership, mainstreaming gender across EU policies, funding issues. There was the first ever LGBTQ equality strategy for 2025. And of course, then the GAP 3, which provides that framework for the Commission and the EU to advance gender equality externally. And it does it in 5 pillars, right? They want gender equality to be recognized as a cross-cutting priority in economic EU programming, that they want to ensure that the EU and its member states prioritize gender equality in engagements at all levels, multilateral, in regional level, country level. They want to pursue engagement and research in 6 themes: gender-based violence, for example, WPS, green transitions, and digital transitions. And again, the focus is on leading by example. And again, we see that there are difficulties in this. So GAP 3 was expected to be adopted as an official Commission communication, which elevates it administratively and institutionally so that this document has more institutional teeth and credibility in the EU. But in late 2020, when the GAP 3 was introduced to be endorsed, to gain the member state endorsement, it was immediately condemned by Poland and Hungary, objecting to the use of the word gender equality, and they refused to endorse it along with Bulgarians. So this was a great shock, I think, to many people, and it was of great concern. But nevertheless, the GAP 3 is not dependent on Council conclusions for its implementation. So the European Union and the Commission is intent on implementing it. But the fact that these setbacks and on gender within the EU is a cause of great concern. And there have been other setbacks. There have been other efforts by Poland and Hungary in May 2021 and in July to sort of on these issues. And in fact, again, in July, the European Commission initiated legal proceedings against Hungary and some regions in Poland over these LGBTQ discriminations, and it continues. So the bottom line is ambitious rhetoric from an institutional commitment, but a poor performance record in the implementation of the policies, and increasingly a worrying backlash against gender equality measures among member states. So for many people, this damages the EU's positioning itself as a global leader on gender equality and in its external relations. And what must the EU do? Walk the talk, and particularly demonstrate its commitment to gender equality in the EU. And I'll stop here and we can continue to have our conversation as we go on.
Thank you, Karen. I think you raise a very important point that we can unpack about the normative value of GAP3 moving forward, and what the relationship is to weakened EU normative power. Roberta, in particular, you write about EU studies as a field of discipline that's ignored and dismissed gender, and of course the importance of EU's normative power. Is the EU's normative power here being weakened? How can the EU champion gender equality in its external relations with women's rights under attack in Poland and Hungary and onward?
Ariela, thank you. That's a great question. I'm actually going to answer by picking up on some of the points that have already been made by Chantal and Karen as well. So you're absolutely right, Chantal and Karen. The EU has sought to position itself historically as an equality actor, as a gender equality actor. And, you know, we can find various statements by European dignitaries saying things similar to equality between women and men is a foundational value in the process of European integration as part of the EU's DNA. And I think in this context, it's really important to focus on the language that is being used. Often the language that is being used is one that treats gender as a binary, and treats gender very much as a liberal, gender equality in a very liberal sort of way. So it's about increasing access and participation, mostly in the employment sphere, increasingly in politics. But this is quite important because in many ways it limits the scope and the competency of the EU to be a gender equality actor. So when Chantal mentioned that equality between men and women is part of the if you wish, in inverted commas, the constitutional framework of the European Union, because it was introduced in the treaties of Rome. This is absolutely right. However, we need to think about which concept of equality was included within this framework. And it was equal pay for equal work. It wasn't even equal pay for work of equal value. That came later with the first Equal Pay Directive. So we need to really consider, A, the rationalities that led to the inclusion of gender equality within the process of European integration, which was an economic rationality. It wasn't that the founding fathers, and I'm using this term quite purposefully, were great feminists. They included the principle of equality because there was serious concern from the French government that they would be at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the textile industry in Italy. Now, why do we have to go through this historical kind of overview? Because this really helps us to understand the limitations of the EU as a normative power, both within the boundaries of the EU, but also externally. So Karen said, the EU needs to walk the talk, and you're absolutely right. So there is a disjuncture. I would call it almost a rhetorical entrapment for the EU to actually live to the norms that is seeking to diffuse and export abroad. However, the EU it's both the institutions, so the European Commission, the Court, and the European Parliament, but it is also the member states, as you have identified. So the acquis, which is the body of European law, which is adopted at the European level through negotiations between the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, then needs to be adopted and implemented at the national level. So what we're seeing here is a real tension within the EU as a system of multi-level governance. Again, this really matters when it comes to gender equality, because it highlights that through compromise within the institutions, there is a shift towards co-opting the language of gender equality, but not necessarily the principle and the transformative agenda that underpin the advocacy work that led to the growth of this policy domain within the social and employment sphere within the European Union. Now, what I think really matters in terms of understanding the EU as a normative actor and a normative gender actor, specifically in the context of external relations, are two things. The first one is the principle of mainstreaming, and the fact that gender mainstreaming is the strategy that the EU adopts for integrating all things gender within its policy. So treating gender as a cross-cutting issue across a range of policy domains. And specifically here, we've seen quite a lot of success in the area of development and aid. So that's probably the area in terms of external relations where the EU has been most successful in integrating a gender perspective. I would say we are seeing developments in WIIS and security within the work of the External Action Service, and specifically of what used to be the principal advisor on WIIS, now the advisors on gender and diversity within the European External Action Service. Where I think is a lot more limited is actually in the area the EU has the strongest kind of power in terms of its soft power, and that is trade. And I'll come back to that in a second, because I think this really matters. And then, you know, Michelle, I think you're going to pick up and discuss the issue of trading more generally. Now, the second area where I think we really need to think about the EU as a normative gender actor is in relations to what we mean by normative power. So to draw on the work of Yamanis, when we think about normative power is what the EU is rather than what EU says, and sorry, what the EU does. It then what shows us that the EU should be a key actor in external affairs in terms of gender, because it should be a norm entrepreneur in this area, and especially in the context of external action. So if we assume that the EU is a normative power, and I'm not necessarily assuming this, then what kind of normative power it is, and really what kind of values of gender equality it's diffusing within the external domain. And one of the things that my research is starting to unpack is the kind of gaze, Eurocentric gaze, that is embedded throughout EU external policies. And especially the way that gender and the role of the EU as a gender norm entrepreneur is being used to reproduce this particular gaze. And in many ways, this liberal Eurocentric gaze does not account for the voices, or does not take into consideration the voices and the viewpoints of women from the global south, and specifically women at the receiving end of the policy that the EU is trying to enact. And this is particularly evident, I think, in the GAP 3, to a certain extent in the gender equality strategy, the strategy as well. Now, is the EU serious about being a normative gender actor in external affairs? And I'm going to go back again to Chantal's opening comments. The proof's in the pudding when it comes to areas of policies which are not gendered, or rather, I would say they're all gendered, but that are perceived to be gender-free and gender-neutral. And here we take the global strategy. If gender is not integrated in a cross-cutting way across key areas of, if you wish, high politics, such as the global strategy, is the EU really a gender norm entrepreneur? And when it does integrate them, what are the values that are integrated? Is gender equality being co-opted in order to achieve higher political priorities? And if so, what does that mean for the future of this institution as a gender equality actor? Now, I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting, and I think my work is somewhat critical of the impact the EU's had in external affairs, and also about the possibility of the EU being a feminist power actor as such. But there are a few things that I think are positive and they are worth highlighting. And that goes back to, again, some of the comments made earlier about the tools and the budget and the resources, right? So there are tools that are at the disposal of European institutions and the members to integrate gender. And the biggest and most effective tool is gender budgeting, ensuring that gender budgeting is mainstream across all domains. And one area where it has started to be mainstream is the European Recovery Plan for a post-COVID recovery. Now, what is interesting about that is that gender equality is specifically identified as a direct target area for the EU's work going forward. And in this regard, the European Commission's budget is quite innovative and quite ambitious. Whether or not they'll be able to fulfill their ambition, it remains to be seen. But I think it is worth highlighting this. So in terms of the external domain, I think there are a number of questions we need to ask about the operationalization of gender equality, specifically, if you wish, in security, right? So the WPS strategy is a really important document. And if you haven't seen it, I'd strongly encourage everyone to have a look, as well as the associated action plan. These are documents that really seek to address the complexity of women, peace, and security. However, beyond the top level, what I'd really like us to consider is which civil society is involved, whose voices are actually included in the context of the operationalization in missions, for instance, of the WPS agenda and the EU's ambition of being and genders advisors located within missions. Understanding how these particular actors work within the context of the complex institutional structure of the EU, I think provides us some really useful insights into the long-term prospects for the EU to be an inclusive, intersectional, and dare I say, potentially decolonial, external actor in terms of mainstreaming gender equality in external affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. We're actually experiencing an occasional drop off in your audio. In case it is a bandwidth issue, I just wanted to let you know before the next round of questions. And of course, audience members, please feel free to put your questions for our panelists into the chat. Michelle, I wanted to turn to you. And I'm struck by the case that Roberta has made about needing gender to be cross-cutting. And personally, I really do resonate with this rhetorical entrapment of the narrative, and wondered whether you could enter into the narrative, talk to us about the state of gender equality and mainstreaming in EU trade policy, continuing that important thread.
Well, I couldn't have picked three more themes that were so relevant in the trade. The first one would be policy commitment from Chantal. The second one would be implementation from Karen. And the third one would be rhetorical entrapment from Roberta. And I think that, let me start off by saying that there is, there's a legal perspective here that's come up. And legally, the Treaty of Lisbon has the notion of promoting gender equality. And we're already seeing from Karen that there is legal challenge from certain member states. So in some degree, even the legal framework is under attack. The second comment that I would raise here is that, there's a sense that is this gender initiatives, whichever field they are in terms of gender mainstreaming or in terms of gender and security, how much of this is a stock-taking exercise versus actual credible commitments and deliverables? And that seems to be something that's coming up. So how does that relate to trade? Well, it was interesting because in 2020, the EU had a trade policy review. And this was a real, new sort of, we hadn't had one since about 2015. And what's really striking is the lack of attention to gender. I went back through it and I found one sentence related to gender. And it's really a setback. And you all made reference to the global strategy and the sort of foreign policy. But if I look back to the earlier previous trade strategy under Cecilia Malmström, and this gets to the issue of leadership style and who is table, she very much had an emphasis much more on gender and trade, whether it was rhetorical entrapment or whether it was, specific initiatives. The point being is we're moving backwards. And the second point I would say is if we look at gender equality or gender issues, not even the word equality in trade agreements, the European Parliament did a review of a lot of these current bilateral and multilateral agreements. And 20% of the agreements with non-European partners make reference to workers' rights. Now, my worry is that all of this attention right now on, supply chain resilience, on human rights in the supply chain, doesn't really talk about it or genderize it. And let's face it, a lot of those supply chains are really in the service sector, which is women. And so 20% of the agreements talk about women's rights. 40% of them include a reference to gender equality in these free trade agreements. And then a number of them talk about women's empowerment. So the language also varies across the agreements. There's a great heterogeneity across them. And secondly, most of them, I won't use the word norms, but most of them are voluntary and non-binding. So it raises the question about enforcement. And here there's a disjuncture between gender, trade, and enforcement. The EU has picked up and really prioritized enforcement of trade, enforcement of fairness in trade, enforcement of trade deals. But those enforcement tools and the new institutional positions that they've created don't really focus on gender. So I would say those are my comments. The final comment I would say is the notion that Roberta talked about multi-level governance. One of the issues here is we're really getting a sense from these presentations of differentiated integration, requiring different gender equality measures and different policies at the national level. And I think we often tend to sort of assume the EU can do everything, but the question is how much competence, how much budget does it have to promote gender equality, and how much of that has got to be bottom up at the national or local level? And I would sort of say one of the big monikers that's been coming around Brussels lately has been the Brussels effect. And we use it in trade, the notion that the EU sort of promotes its standards and norms in the trade arena in particular. And I think that that Brussels effect, we should sort of say to Brussels, instead of promoting your norms and saying that, you're advancing all these issues and norms and standards and rules that you think everybody else in trade should accept, maybe you might want to look at what other initiatives are going on globally or within other nation states. And so I would finish by saying this. I think that instead of looking at a Brussels effect at the European level, I think we should do a little bit more and look at national innovations. What is being done in regard to pay equality, corporate boards, pay equity, feminist foreign policy? What lessons can the EU learn from what's successful at the national level? And so I would end with that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate that intervention. I think that it's very important to really think about trade and gender in terms of this sort of multi-sectoral, decentralized way, and really sort of pose these questions to the broader group and to the audience at large. Just wanted to move forward to looking at this question of institutional reform and also making recommendations forward. As a reminder to audience members, please drop your questions in the chat so our panelists have an opportunity to reflect and respond to your particular questions and viewpoints. Karen, I want to turn to you again. An area that has been highlighted, but we haven't mentioned that it comes through so clearly in your report, is about security and defense policy. Can you talk a little bit about how the EU can involve more women in common security and defense policy missions and in the European External Action Service, the EEAS?
Sure. Again, my sort of impetus was trying to look at Ursula von der Leyen's mainstreaming, or the attempt to establish gender mainstreaming as a top priority institutionally. She pushed for gender parity in EU institutions, and she did achieve that with her own College of Commissioners. But again, as we know, the record across EU agencies is lagging, and this unfortunately also includes the European External Action Service, the EEAS, and we see the same kind of difficulties institutionally in the missions as well. But with the EEAS, to be sure, right? It's young. It's only a decade old, just over a decade old. It has published its own EEAS action plan on women, peace, and security, which also promotes a stronger role for women in EU missions. And its first two representatives, high representatives, were women. But again, observers has pointed out that we are sort of not moving forward. In fact, there are also setbacks here in which the current High Representative, Josep Borrell, nominated and put in his 3 top-level positions, the senior appointments were all men, and no gender inclusion, no geographic diversity at all. And so the EEAS has a reputation still of being stubbornly wedded to an add women and stir attitude. And obviously people feel that things are not moving forward. In fact, the European Parliament's own report on the EEAS was very critical of its underperformance in meeting its own gender targets. And it outlined some of the problems. So specifically, again, this persistent problem of few women reaching the top levels of management and decision-making positions. It's better at the middle management level, but not in, again, some of these hard sort of foreign and security policy areas. There's no diversity. There's a lack of gender-responsive recruitment procedures. Leadership is lacking. And in fact, there's insufficient data in many ways for, understanding what's going on. And we need more gender disaggregated data as well. And given all this, again, what recommendations can we make to improve the EEAS's record on gender? These institutional processes that are the stumbling blocks sound not just something that is necessary in EEAS and in the foreign and security policy, but also just more generally, right? You implement gender responsive recruitment strategies, you revise the job descriptions, you promote the promotion and application requirements and procedures. Don't make them so difficult for women to apply. You address, work-life balance. You take into account also, we need to say, how the COVID pandemic has affected all of this in this work-life balance. And you promote women. You adjust and you mandate training and curricular programs to maximize gender mainstreaming, right? So the recommendations are doable. They can be enacted without significant expenditure. So implementation depends on the EU leading by example, as we've talked about. Strong leadership depends on finding the political will to bring about that real change. And real change towards gender equality has to be supported by all of the EU member states. With regard then, if we turn to CSDP missions, again, in many ways, we find the same kinds of problems, same kinds of recommendations for reform, though there are other, obviously, different issues because it is in a different context. So obviously, attitudes and prejudices about women in the military, they shouldn't be soldiers, they're not physically capable of doing the work, toxic masculine work environments, especially the recruitment and retention policies, lack of leadership support, funding problems. And in the research that I did, what was particularly disturbing was this lack of gender disaggregated data. For example, in several of the reports, there just simply wasn't any data between, say, 2000 and 2009 and 2012. So if the data doesn't exist, we can't understand some of these issues. With the military missions, only about 11% of military staff are women. That number is increasing slowly, but it's not doing very well. Police missions, on the other hand, not surprisingly, do better, with an average representation of about 25%. Similar problems with fewer women being promoted to head missions and commanders of military missions, and the missions thus fail to use female personnel in ways that can advance objectives, mission objectives, right? Those are evident. We have lots of evidence to show how important women are in military missions. They can secure access to groups that men can't, they can collect intelligence, diversity benefits decision-making processes, better work environments. But again, this requires leadership, and that leadership is lacking. What also is relevant, I think, in our discussion is that the military missions lack gender advisors. So not the case, however, with civilian missions. So again, with regard to civilian missions, we have the same kind of problems, but one of the things that was very clear was for example, one of the problems that we see on recruitment and having to nominate civilian personnel. This goes back to the problem about differing attitudes among the nation states about gender, because national governments second civilian personnel. And there are problems with this particular process, because if you have national governments putting up fewer women in the selection process, then you will have fewer women being going into these civilian missions. So the biggest problem in both of the types of missions is first, insufficient data to make any informed assessment, and no reliable data in order for us to understand, for example, what kind of impact gender inclusion, gender participation in civilian and military missions can mean for mission success and for the implementation, right, a successful implementation of these mission objectives. So again, as evident from this discussion, many experts have focused on institutional reforms, speaking here, but I think, again, what's particularly important to understand is how not implementing the EU gender equality strategy has a damaging impact on the effectiveness of the EU's external action and its missions. And what legitimacy, in the end, what legitimacy does the EU have to promote abroad the principles of gender equality if it's incapable of applying them at home? And that, again, we circle back again and again to these problems, and I hope what we can maybe talk a little bit more at length at how we can try to get at some of these more persistent problems. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karen. I think that was an excellent case made for the persistent gender data gap to be filled, both for the collection of information for relevant policies, but also to ensure implementation. Roberta, I want to turn to you about that data gap. In general, we talk about this so many times. What do we need to do for those shortfalls, which still is pervasive across sectors, but also including the military defense aspects? We're still relying on NATO data, and it's still quite insufficient. Where do you see the need for feminist research on the EU that draws into better quality data, and how can we make that case for funding?
Another great question. So the data side it's quite a simple one. Well, it's quite simple as it is complicated, right? Because there needs to be the will and the processes and structures in place to be able to collect the data. That's the starting point. We can't fix a problem if we don't know the scale and the impact of that problem more generally. So we need that kind of data in order to be able to actually address it. And we should have both sex-based data, but also gender identity-based data, so that we don't keep reproducing the idea of gender as a binary. Fully understanding that this is going to be a very difficult message to get through, especially given some of the conversations we've just had. In terms of the research that needs to be done, and this links directly to the conversation we're having today. I think there are three key areas that really need focus and attention from a feminist perspective. The first one is the area of democratic backsliding and the gendered impact of that, especially in the way that gender has become problematized. So where gender equality has become associated or has been understood as a frame for gender ideologies, assuming that gender ideologies only apply to LGBT issues, this has become a discursive battleground, right, for a wider and deeper retrenchment of social, reproductive, and economic rights. So we really need to look at how gender equality is the weather vane in many ways for this kind of democratic backsliding, and especially if the EU is to be a normative actor, broadly speaking, this is one of the key indicators we need to look at. The second one is through the way that the EU seeks to project its role as an external actor. So here I'm specifically thinking about the role of language, of equality and equity, how it might be co-opted, how it might be securitized in the pursuit of objectives that are not aligned with social justice and feminist principles. So we really need to start to unpack the notion of equality that is embedded within external actions. And finally, one of the areas that really needs urgent attention is to do with the interpretation of WPS and the way that it is enacted in terms of not just the strategy, but also the member states. Specifically, I think we need to extend this discussion of WPS to a more detailed assessment of Europe's borderlands. So the humanitarian crisis relating to migration, the humanitarian crisis that is really unfolding on both the land borders and the sea borders of Europe. It's a matter for WPS more broadly, and the gendered nature of that is one that we need to really unpack. In the case of the UK, we've seen possibly one of the worst tragedies in the English Channel, where around 30 migrants died trying to cross the channel. Many of those were women and children. And very few questions are being asked about why it is that migrants are taking such steps, but also the gender nature of family reunification policy in terms of migration law, refugee law. Those are the kind of questions that really need to start to be asked. And I think WPS provides a really useful and important framework for thinking about the work that is taking place within the borders of Europe and not just outside.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I just also wanted to give in this last segment a chance for Michelle to give her insights both on what has broadly been spoken about, but also reflecting on Karen's mentioning of the shadow pandemic. We know that economic development and social equality tend to go hand in hand. From your perspective, what would gender responsive trade policies look like? And how can we improve women's access to the benefits of trades? How can we accomplish those quick wins during the shadow pandemic when so much challenges to economic progress are experienced by women in Europe?
Absolutely. You know, in some respects, it is 1 in 5 women lead an export firm. And so, the question goes back to the fact that we don't keep, as people pointed out, a lot of gender disaggregated data across different sectors to know how are they being impacted by the pandemic. So I would say that there are a few things that we can do. And, the first one that Roberta has alluded to, which is the Next Gen Economic Recovery, has some segments related to gender. And I would say that any trade adjustment assistance policy, whether it's the US, whether it's the European Globalization Fund, whether it's trade for aid, all of those should have certain amount of resources targeted to women in the economy, women entrepreneurs, women for access to microfinance. So that would be the first sort of big basket. And that can be both internal to the EU, but also external as well in terms of external trade policy. The second thing I would say is I would go outside of the formal institutions. We've talked a lot about the EU institutions, and what's very, very striking in terms of trade policy, but I would imagine it is also in other policy areas as well, is how much there is a shadow network of experts, advisory boards, regulatory agencies. I looked up the EU ISS security studies as well. They've had one report on gender in their entire existence. And so my comment is when I look at who's appointed to investment screening boards or regulatory impact assessment or trade and advisory boards, some of these are making important decisions and they are heavily male. So I think that's an area. We tend to always look at the formal institutions, but I think the informality also creates barriers to access and participation. And so I suppose the third point is look outside the EU. And my comment here is I'm finding the most innovative strategies in the trade arena are actually coming from small states. It is Chile, Canada, and New Zealand that actually are launching really a dynamic agenda about financial inclusion, capacity building, access to digital platforms, government procurement access, licensing, access to, service provisions. We tend to forget that that's really important to help women be entrepreneurs, to trade, to basically reduce barriers to access. And so all of those things can be done both internally within the EU and also externally with our trade partners. So I would say rather than have a Brussels effect and assume everything comes out of Brussels, take a look around the world and take a look at what others are doing in terms of their gender policy innovative mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I have an audience question that I want to give our panelists an opportunity. We've moved from the loftiest conversations about legitimacy and normative frameworks to an area that we want to progress around in terms of concrete implementation. And riffing off of what Michelle said, this question is about the practical hiring practices of the European Personnel Selection Office. The question is as follows. According to a report by the European Court of Editors, EU institutions' current selection process for staff hampers geographic and socioeconomic diversity. Only a certain type of women ever get to hold an EU job. What are your suggestions on how to reform the European Personnel Selection Office to make the recruitment process for EU jobs more equitable and accessible for women and diverse types of backgrounds? Michelle, I wanted to ask you if there was an additional practical suggestions that you had. I then wanted to have sort of Karen respond because I know this has been part of the more detailed recommendations and consideration of the report. And then Roberta, I know you've also spoken a lot about the binary aspects that have been presented. So please, if we can just go in that order for our final remarks.
Well, I think there is, the first issue is we have to have data on transparency of recruitment. And one area that people often get into the European institutions is through a stage, through what's effectively an internship. The question is, are they paid or unpaid? Because that creates barriers to access. The second issue is when you do sit the EU exam, you're put in a blue book for 2 years. And that blue book is sort of open of people who are eligible. And the question then becomes, who's getting to choose those people in that book? And what difference does that make, you know, by gender, by nationality, by also the fact that we haven't raised women of color? And so I really do think there are certain issues about transparency and, you know, providing funded opportunities for women, almost like fellowships, but calling them stages, in making sure that there is gender balance in those. And I would go back and I would also say that, you know, Roberta raised this about how many people in the national context are often seconded to the European External Action Service or serve, you know, within the European institutions. That's on member states to ensure diversity, gender equity, and a diverse set of voices. And so it's not just a European problem, it's also a nation state one.
I think it's particularly important to talk about the responsibility of the member states also in that attempt at diversity and providing to support women in the recruitment process. I mean, a lot of the difficulties are just, again, things that don't take a lot of financial commitment to do. It means looking at how we understand the tools and mechanisms that are used for recruitment, for personnel policies, and taking apart the things that are gender neutral and infusing them with gender equality sort of principles that will bring more women, hopefully, in to the process. And that's part of the problem, the job descriptions, but also, again, one of the interesting things is about the secondment in the external action and in the missions, because when the member states have to put up then and into the system and into the selection process the names of the individuals they wish to have sort of appointed. And if we don't have, this is again one of the sort of the problems we have, sort of looking at institutional mechanisms that we can change, but how do we work at changing the perceptions of some of the member states, that it is it is an advantage to have women in these middle and top ranking positions and decision-making positions. And how do you do that if they are unwilling to put up and into the selection process the names of the women? And so part of it, again, is just looking at the promotion procedures, application requirements and procedures, job descriptions, promotion policies is very important. But again, part of it is just, again, having a commitment to consistently look at monitoring and assessing where the gaps are and taking leadership to push these policies towards policies that will provide women with more advantages in getting into the streamline and into the pipeline towards being taken seriously and promoted throughout EU institutions. So again, it's one of these half and half problems, but I think most importantly, changing attitudes and perceptions about the advantage about women in these positions is probably the most important thing and the most difficult one.
Roberta, you have the last word before I close this out. Do you have any additional comments?
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on something you said in your final question, which is about moving beyond the gender binary, right? And I think it's actually really important to think about gender in a more holistic way. to the gender, and when we think about gender equality, is not just the binary men and women, but also that we need to apply an intersectional lens, because, you know, we've already raised issues of social justice and social access, socioeconomic access, in order to address some of the issues around participation. But this also matters in relations to the overarching thrust of the policies and the impact of the EU as a gender actor, both internally as well as externally. The EU has done quite a lot in thinking about gender equality in a very traditional liberal kind of way. However, it's still in its infancy when it comes to understanding the intersectional dimension of gender equality and its role, especially when it comes to external affairs. So we really need to think about how to bring intersectionality into the fold and to really push the idea that gender is not just about bringing women into, which is important in terms of representation, bringing women into sites of power, but it's also about challenging hegemonic structures of power themselves. So the structures that reproduce these processes that tend to exclude women, people of color, disabled people, and more broadly, it's about the social justice agenda at the heart of the campaigns that brought gender equality to the process of European integration.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I think that's exactly the right note for us to carry forward and to continue mainstreaming within our conversations on this important topic. I wanted to close us out as we are just past the hour. Thank you to the Wilson Center Global European Program. Thank you so much to Chantal. And please join me in applauding either by chat icon or in real life, Chantal, Karen, Roberta, and Michelle. Again, we've had a wonderful conversation about advancing gender representation and equality in the European Union in the foreign policy, security policy, trade, and moving forward, we will continue this discussion. So thank you for joining us today.